Most dynasties fall once. The Romanovs fell twice, first when the Tsar abdicated in March of 1917, and then again, more completely, in the basement of a house in Yekaterinburg in the early hours of the 17th of July, 1918. The second fall is the one history remembers, but what happened after it is a story that has never quite been settled, because not everyone who should have died that night stayed dead in the public record, and not everyone who survived the revolution found a life that could be called living. The mystery of two missing children, one of them the most famous missing person of the 20th century, ran for 90 years before the physical evidence closed it. The impersonation it generated lasted longer than the empire whose crown it claimed. The family of Nicholas II, the last emperor of all the Russias, consisted of 6 people in that basement: the Tsar himself, his wife Alexandra, and their 5 children. Olga was 22, Tatiana was 21, Maria was 19, Anastasia was 17, and Alexei, the only son, the heir to 300 years of Romanov rule, was 13 years old. What happened to those children, the ones who died, the ones whose deaths were concealed by deliberate Soviet policy, and the one whose fate generated a century of claims, lawsuits, impersonation, and a legal proceeding that ran for 32 years without resolving the central question, is one of the most examined and most misunderstood stories to come out of the Russian Revolution. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. To understand what the children's deaths meant, and why the uncertainty around 2 of them lasted as long as it did, you have to understand what kind of prisoners they were, and how completely the Bolshevik leadership had decided that they needed to disappear. By the spring of 1918, the civil war between the Red Army and the White Army was moving toward the Ural region. Yekaterinburg, where the family was being held in the Ipatiev House, a 2-story merchant's home that had been requisitioned and renamed the House of Special Purpose, sat directly in the path of the advancing White forces. The Bolshevik leadership in Moscow, and in particular Yakov Sverdlov, the chairman of the All-Russian Central Executive Committee, had grown concerned that a White capture of the city might produce a live Tsar. A live Tsar was a problem they were not prepared to manage. The Ipatiev House was no palace. The family had been confined to the upper floor since late April. The windows were painted over so that the children could not be seen from the street and could not see out. Armed guards rotated through the ground floor and the yard. The commandant, Yakov Yurovsky, was a former watchmaker from Tomsk who had joined the Cheka, the Bolshevik secret police, and who ran the house with a thoroughness that the family appears to have understood, without being told directly, was not temporary. Alexandra kept a diary until almost the end. Her final entry was dated the 16th of July, 1918. She wrote about the heat. She noted that the family had been woken the night before and brought to the cellar under the pretext that artillery fire was approaching and the upper floor was unsafe. She did not record what happened next, because nothing happened that first night. The evacuation was a rehearsal. The execution came the following evening. In the weeks before the 17th of July, the Regional Bolshevik Council had been in contact with Moscow about what to do with the prisoners. The exact nature of those communications remained classified in Soviet archives for decades. What the record shows is that Yurovsky received authorization, the precise source of which Soviet historians obscured and post-Soviet researchers have continued to argue over, to liquidate the family before the city fell. He was given a specific timeline. He acted within it. Shortly after midnight on the 17th, the family and their 4 remaining servants were woken and told again that they were being moved for safety. They were brought to the basement room, 12 feet by 13 feet, with a single arched window facing the yard, and told to wait. Yurovsky then entered with a detail of 11 men. He read a short statement. Nicholas said something in response that witnesses later recalled differently. The shooting began almost immediately. What followed was not clean. The room was small. The number of people in it was larger than the space could efficiently accommodate for what was being done, and several of the children did not die quickly. Alexandra and Olga died fast. Nicholas died in the first volley. Tatiana, Maria, and Alexei survived the initial shooting and were finished with rifle butts and bayonets. Anastasia, according to at least 2 accounts recorded by members of Yurovsky's detail in the years after, was the last to die. She had fainted and was still alive when the smoke cleared. The nature of exactly how she died and whether she was conscious became a detail that later impersonators would exploit in ways that Yurovsky could not have anticipated. The bodies were loaded onto a truck and taken to an abandoned mine shaft outside the city. The first disposal attempt failed. The mine was too shallow, the bodies surfaced, and Yurovsky was forced to move them. He spent 2 days trying to destroy or conceal the remains. They were eventually buried in 2 separate locations along the Koptyaki road, a detail that would not be confirmed for 7 decades, and that explains, precisely, why the mystery of 2 missing children lasted as long as it did. Yurovsky himself wrote a memorandum describing the disposal process. That memorandum was preserved in a Soviet archive. It described the separation of 2 bodies from the main group. It sat in that archive, classified and inaccessible, for most of the 20th century. The White Army took Yekaterinburg on the 25th of July, 1918, 8 days after the execution. They found the Ipatiev House empty, and the basement room stained with what appeared to be blood, recently and incompletely washed. The walls showed bullet holes and marks consistent with the use of edged weapons at close range. An investigator named Nikolai Sokolov was eventually appointed by the white government to examine the site and trace what had happened. Sokolov was a trained jurist who had served as an examining magistrate before the revolution, and he approached the case with the procedural thoroughness of someone who understood that the evidence he gathered might need to stand in court. He worked the Ipatiev house room by room, interviewed witnesses including members of Yurovsky's guard detail who had not yet been captured, and followed the physical trail to the Koptyaki road. He found the first burial area there in 1919 and recovered fragments of bone, teeth, pieces of clothing, a woman's finger, and a set of false teeth that were later identified as belonging to the family physician, Dr. Eugene Botkin, who had been shot alongside them. He recovered corset stays consistent with those worn by the Tsarina. He did not find anything that would have proven definitively that all 5 children had been killed, because the remains he found were fragmentary and the burial site he located held only some of what had been brought there. His report, completed after the White Army collapsed and he had fled Russia, was published in Paris in 1924. It named all 7 family members as dead, based on the weight of physical and testimonial evidence available to him. The Soviet government did not confirm or deny the killings in specific terms for years, and did not formally acknowledge that the Tsar had been executed on central orders until 1992, more than 7 decades after the fact. The gap between what Sokolov concluded in 1924 and what the Soviet government admitted in 1992 is 68 years of official silence. The silence created a space, and into that space, over the following decade, came the claimants. The most significant, and the one whose case generated the longest legal and scientific record of any false identity claim in modern history, appeared in Berlin in 1920. A young woman had been pulled from a Landwehr canal in February of that year after an apparent suicide attempt. She was taken to a psychiatric hospital at Dahldorf, where she refused to give her name and remained unidentified for nearly 2 years. In the winter of 1921, a fellow patient named Clara Puthert became convinced that the woman resembled photographs of the Grand Duchess Tatiana. Word spread through the community of Russian émigrés in Berlin. When members of that community came to examine her, the woman denied being Tatiana. She said, after further questioning, that she was Anastasia. The woman who came to be known as Anna Anderson made her claim at a time when no body had been found, no burial site identified, and when the Soviet government had given no official account of the executions beyond a brief statement confirming that Nicholas alone had been shot, with the family evacuated to a safe location. That lie held for years. It gave Anderson's claim room to exist, and more than that, it gave it room to grow into one of the most contested identity disputes of the 20th century. Over the next several decades, Anna Anderson was examined by surviving members of the Romanov family, by courtiers, by former servants of the Imperial household, and by investigators hired by parties with interests on both sides. The results were never consistent. Some who had known Anastasia well said Anderson was genuine. Others who had been closer still said she was not. Princess Irene of Prussia, the Tsar's sister-in-law, met Anderson twice and concluded she was an impostor. The Grand Duchess Olga, Nicholas's surviving sister, initially visited Anderson and showed signs of warmth, but later wrote to a friend that she was certain the woman was not her niece, though she could not say who she was. Pierre Gilliard, the children's former French tutor who had been with the family until shortly before their arrest, examined Anderson at length and published a book in 1929 concluding that she was not Anastasia. His wife, who had served as Alexandra's personal attendant and had known the children from their infancy, agreed with her husband's conclusion after conducting her own examination. Anderson herself was an uneven witness to her own story. She had detailed knowledge of the Imperial family's private life that impressed those who questioned her, and she carried it in an unusual way, not as a recitation of memorized facts, but as something closer to recalled experience, with the specific texture of lived memory. She also had gaps that were harder to explain. Her German was native. Anastasia had spoken German, but not as a first language. When pressed on this, Anderson gave different explanations at different times. The legal proceedings began in 1938, when Anderson brought a claim in a Hamburg court to establish her identity as Anastasia Romanov and thereby establish inheritance rights to Romanov funds held in German banks. The case ran, with interruptions, for 32 years. The Hamburg court rejected her claim in 1961. An appeal was decided against her in 1967 on the ground that she had not proven her identity, which was legally distinct from a finding that she had disproven it. The case formally closed without establishing who she was. It is one of the longest civil proceedings in German legal history and reached no conclusion about the central question it had been convened to answer. Anna Anderson died in Charlottesville, Virginia, in 1984. She had married an American historian named John Manahan in 1968 and lived her final years in the United States, in a house that became notable for its disorder, keeping animals she could not properly care for, and arguing with neighbors and with various officials who tried to intervene. She died as she had lived since 1920, without a confirmed identity, without settled claim, and without the answer that the case had always required. A tissue sample from a medical procedure she had undergone in the 1970s had been preserved by the hospital in Charlottesville. That sample would eventually speak where Anderson could not. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The physical answer came in stages. In 1979, two Russian amateur investigators named Alexander Avdonin and Gely Ryabov located a grave site along the Koptyaki road outside Yekaterinburg. They had been working from Yurovsky's memorandum, which had made its way out of the archive through unofficial channels. The memorandum described the burial clearly enough that Ryabov and Avdonin found the site and exhumed 3 skulls. They then reburied them and said nothing publicly for a decade, out of concern about what the Soviet government would do with the information. In 1991, after the Soviet Union's dissolution had made disclosure less dangerous, the grave was officially reopened. 9 sets of remains were recovered. Forensic analysis, including mitochondrial DNA testing conducted in cooperation with British scientists and cross-referenced against living maternal line relatives of the Romanovs, including Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, whose mother, Princess Alice, was a granddaughter of Queen Victoria and a relative of the Tsarina through the Hessian line, confirmed the identities of Nicholas, Alexandra, and 3 of the 5 children. The children identified were Olga, Tatiana, and 1 other. The remains of Alexei and 1 of the daughters were not in the grave. That absence was the one the record had been waiting to confirm. 2 of the children had been buried separately, as Yurovsky's memorandum had indicated. He had written that 2 bodies were burned and the remains buried apart from the main group, to confuse anyone who found the primary site. The question of which daughter was missing remained open for another 17 years. The DNA evidence pointed to Maria. The grave's absence, combined with the physical evidence of the burial that had been done separately, meant that neither Alexei nor 1 sister had been in the primary pit along the Koptyaki road. In 2007, an amateur archaeologist named Leonid Vodyasov found a second burial site a short distance from the first, also along the Koptyaki road, in a section of forest that had not been excavated in the earlier investigation. The remains recovered there consisted of fragments from 2 individuals, heavily charred, consistent with an attempt at cremation that had not been completed. DNA testing completed in 2008 confirmed that the fragments were the remains of Alexei and Maria. The entire family was now accounted for. Every member of the 6 who had entered the basement room on the 17th of July, 1918, was now identified in a grave along a road outside the city where they had been held. And that left Anna Anderson. In 1994, DNA testing was conducted on the preserved tissue sample from Charlottesville and compared against a blood sample provided by Karl Maucher, a living maternal line relative of a Polish factory worker named Franziska Szankowska, who had gone missing from Berlin in 1920, at approximately the same time the woman later known as Anna Anderson had appeared. The mitochondrial DNA matched Mosher. It did not match any Romanov line. The test was replicated and its conclusions confirmed. Anna Anderson was Franziska Szankowska, a woman with a documented history of mental illness, who had been injured in a factory accident in 1916 and who had disappeared into a wartime and post-war Berlin that gave her the conditions to become someone else. The question of how she acquired the knowledge she demonstrated, the specific domestic details of Imperial life that convinced some observers, was never fully resolved. The most credible explanation, supported by investigators who examined the case after the DNA findings, is that she was coached in the early period of her claim by émigré circles who had reason to want the story to be true, and that she absorbed and retained what she was told with unusual consistency. The émigré community in Berlin in the early 1920s contained people who had served the imperial household and who knew its private routines in detail. Anderson had access to them, and they had reason to share what they knew. Whether she believed the identity herself, at any point, is a question the record cannot answer. What the record does show is what happened to the daughters and the son who actually existed, beyond the basement room. Olga, Tatiana, Maria, and Anastasia had grown up in a world whose dimensions they did not control, and whose end they could not have anticipated. The four sisters were trained as nurses during the First World War, and worked in actual hospital wards at Tsarskoye Selo, changing dressings and sitting with the dying, a fact that sat oddly against the image of sheltered imperial children that later mythology sometimes preferred. Olga in particular found the work wearing, and wrote about it honestly. Anastasia, too young at the outbreak to nurse alongside her sisters, worked in a children's ward. She was known among those who treated her letters as a writer of unusual wit, someone who could describe the tedium and indignity of confinement with a precision that suggested she would have made something of herself in different circumstances. Alexei had hemophilia, a bleeding disorder passed through the maternal line from Queen Victoria, that made every injury potentially fatal and that shaped the family's internal life more than almost anything else. His condition was concealed from the public and managed within a circle of palace officials and physicians. It was the lever that Grigory Rasputin used to establish his influence over Alexandra. Whatever else Rasputin was, and the historical record on this question is considerably less dramatic than the legend, he appeared able to calm the boy during hemophilic crises in ways that the court physicians could not, and Alexandra's desperation to protect her son made her vulnerable to anyone who could offer that relief. The relationship between Alexandra and Rasputin, and the political damage it caused to the imperial image in the final years before the revolution, is part of the reason the abdication of March 1917 found so little organized resistance. The lives those 5 children had lived before the revolution ended in stages that grew progressively more confined. The abdication came in the first week of March of 1917. House arrest at Tsarskoye Selo began almost immediately. By the summer of 1917, the family had been moved to Tobolsk in western Siberia, a provincial city far enough from the centers of power that the provisional government believed it was safe to hold them there. In the spring of 1918, as Bolshevik control extended across the country and the Civil War shifted the geography of risk, the family was moved again to Yekaterinburg. The move was made by train, in stages, with Alexei and 2 of the sisters following later because he was too ill to travel with the first group. The children made lives in each place in the way that children do, constrained by circumstances that had no precedent in their experience. They staged plays. They kept diaries. They photographed each other in the gardens when gardens were available. Anastasia wrote letters with a wit that made some of her correspondents note that she seemed to treat the situation as something that would eventually end. Tatiana organized the household routines with a practicality that the servants later recalled as remarkable, given what was happening around them. Olga read extensively and grew quieter as the months passed. Maria, described by virtually everyone who knew her as the most open-hearted of the 4 sisters, continued to make friends among the guards, with a cheerfulness that some of those guards found, years later when they wrote about it, the hardest thing to account for. In Tobolsk, the family had some freedom of movement within the house and grounds. Alexei and his sisters built a snow mountain in the yard during the winter of 1917-18 and spent hours on it. When the order came in the spring to move the family to Yekaterinburg, the snow mountain was still standing. The guards who remained behind after the transfer reported that they left it alone. At the Ipatiev House, there was no garden access and no yard time that was not supervised and brief. The painted windows meant that the children could not watch the street below or see the sky, except from the angle where the paint had been applied imperfectly. By July of 1918, they had been under some form of house arrest for more than 2 years. It did end, in the way that Yurovsky's detail made it end, on a night when the eldest daughter was 22 years old and the youngest was 13. The broader Romanov family did not end in that basement. Nicholas had numerous relatives, many of whom had fled Russia before or during the revolution. 18 members of the extended Romanov family were killed by the Bolsheviks in the summer of 1918, including several Grand Dukes executed at the Peter and Paul Fortress in Petrograd, or thrown into a mine shaft in the Urals. Grand Duke Mikhail Alexandrovich, Nicholas's younger brother, had been shot in the Perm forest in June of that year, becoming the first of the family to be killed, but others survived. Grand Duke Kirill Vladimirovich, a first cousin of Nicholas, escaped through Finland and eventually made his way to Western Europe, where in 1924 he declared himself guardian of the Russian throne, and in 1926 claimed the title of Emperor in exile. His descendants continued the senior surviving male line of the Romanovs and maintain that claim today. Grand Duchess Olga Alexandrovna, the Tsar's youngest sister, escaped through the Caucasus in 1920 with her second husband, Colonel Nikolai Kulikovsky, and their young sons. She lived in Denmark for many years on a farm near Copenhagen, supporting herself in part by selling her paintings, before emigrating to Canada in 1948, when the political situation in post-war Europe made Denmark feel less secure. She ended her life in a modest apartment outside Toronto. She spent years giving interviews about her family, and in those interviews she was consistent about one thing. She believed all 5 children were dead. The case against Anderson had been, for her, not primarily a matter of forensics but of personal knowledge. She had known Anastasia her entire life, had held her as an infant, and had seen her grow up. The woman in the Berlin hospital was not her. The Ipatiev House stood in Yekaterinburg until 1977, when Boris Yeltsin, then the Communist Party chief for the Sverdlovsk region, ordered it demolished. The demolition was carried out at night and completed within days. The stated reason was road construction. The road was not built. The site remained a vacant lot for years, a rectangle of cleared ground in the middle of a city that had been renamed Sverdlovsk, and that had spent decades being told, officially, that nothing of particular significance had happened there. In 2003, the Church on the Blood was consecrated on that location, a 5-domed Orthodox cathedral built directly over the footprint of the house where the family died. Pilgrims come to it from across Russia and from communities of Russian Orthodox faithful around the world. The structure is large, formal, and permanently attended. Every year on the night of the 16th to 17th of July, a liturgical procession walks from the church through the city to the Ganina Yama monastery complex near the first burial site, following, in reverse, the route that Yurovsky's truck took with the bodies in the early hours of 1918. Thousands of people walk it. The procession has been held annually since the late 1990s. The basement room, reconstructed in approximation below the main church, is part of the complex. There are icons of the last Tsar and his family, canonized by the Russian Orthodox Church as Passion Bearers in the year 2000, a designation that honors those who accepted death with Christian humility, rather than claiming them as martyrs in the theological sense. The church draws visitors who come specifically for the site, to stand in a room designed to recall the room where the 17th of July ended, and to place flowers and light candles in a space that looks nothing like what was there in 1918, but that stands on the same ground. The bones were the last difficulty. The remains recovered in 1991 were held by the Russian state for years, while the question of what to do with them remained caught between the government, the church, and the surviving Romanov family, each of whom had different concerns about the forensic conclusions and what a formal ceremony would mean. The Orthodox Church initially declined to accept the DNA findings as sufficient grounds for identification. The head of the Imperial House in exile, Grand Duchess Maria Vladimirovna, expressed reservations about the process. In 1998, the remains of Nicholas, Alexandra, and the 3 identified children were interred at the Peter and Paul Cathedral in St. Petersburg, the traditional burial place of the Tsars, in a ceremony presided over by President Boris Yeltsin. He called the burial a matter of national conscience and an act of atonement for one of the most shameful pages in Russian history. The church held a parallel service but did not formally participate. The remains of Alexei and Maria, identified in 2008, were not interred until 2015, when they were placed in a side chapel of the same cathedral, in a ceremony that the church again attended without fully endorsing the forensic conclusions. The family was together again, underground, in the city where the dynasty had been founded and where it had reigned. The question of full ecclesiastical recognition of the identifications remained open as of the years following. That unresolved quality is characteristic of the entire history of how the children's deaths have been processed. A century passed between the night in the basement and the full interment of all 5 children. In that century, the story was used for different purposes by different parties. By émigré communities who needed the possibility of survival to sustain their own sense of a world that still existed somewhere. By the Soviet government that needed the killings to remain obscure enough that the act could be neither fully owned nor fully disowned. By courts that needed to parse identity law against claims of uncertain origin. And by a woman who may or may not have known, by the end of her long, strange life, who she actually was. What the physical evidence shows, when placed against what the claims required it to contain, is something considerably simpler than the mythology required. 5 children entered a basement in the early hours of the 17th of July, 1918. 5 children did not leave it. The evidence for this has been available in its complete form since 2008. The question of Anastasia was answered definitively in 1994. The question of Alexei and Maria was answered 14 years after that. The answers took far longer to reach public consciousness than the science required, because by the time the evidence was gathered, the myth had been running for longer than many of the people who believed it had been alive. Franziska Schanzkowska was buried in Seon, Germany, under the name she had claimed and lived with for 64 years. The grave marker reads Anna Anderson. The woman she claimed to be lies in the Peter and Paul Cathedral in St. Petersburg under her own name, beside her sisters and her brother and her parents, in a room that took 8 decades and 2 grave sites to prepare. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.